thanks to all the sponsors for this great event. I've had the pleasure of meeting a number of you since last evening. I met Mayor Healy back there last evening, and I was say to him that I one time had the same type of job that Fonda, his chief of staff, has today, and so I have a great amount of empathy for the job of a chief executive of a city, and I also think that the mayor gets it, you know, that he went to the industry and saw shale gas as the opportunity that it is, and I have to tell you that not every mayor does that. I also have a great amount of respect for the job that Dave does at the Chamber, because I used to do it. I was vice president of my hometown's Chamber of Commerce in Danbury, Connecticut, and then there are some people here who are in the communications and media business, and I'd like to think of myself as a journalist because I have a Twitter account, and I guess that's sort of what counts for being a journalist in this decade. I'm not sure that's a good thing. So what I want to talk about, first of all, is Dow and our, we do have a stake in this state. We've got about 7 facilities and about 350 employees, and we have about 1,400 retirees who we'd like to keep sending pension checks to. I will be joining them in January, so I'm very interested in that. I'm a senior advisor now. That's probably the best job I've had in the company since I surrendered my portfolio in August. Senior advisor is, if you've been to, on a highway project, a guy standing on top of the trench, pointing to everybody in the trench saying, "You missed a spot." That's my job. Dow's founder, Herbert Henry Dow, moved from Canada to Ohio and went to school at Case, the predecessor of Case Western, and taught in Cleveland for a while, and actually looked at brine under the surface of the ground here in Canton, because brine turned out to be a great source of raw material for the manufacture of bromine. He ultimately wound up where his investors were, which is in Midland, Michigan, and which is why Dow is headquartered there, and maybe not here, who knows. I want to talk a little bit about Dow's stake in this natural gas phenomenon, why it's important, the nature of the competitive advantage, which both Kevin and Tom have really elaborated on, so I won't go into great detail on that. Talk to you a little bit more about how we see the manufacturing renaissance that's resulting from this amazing gift. And are there any natural gas producers in the audience? Raise your hand. Well, let me just say in absentia, thank you for this wonderful gift that you have given this country, because it wasn't too many years ago that we were wondering where the gas was going to come from and where we were going to invest our next dollar. And fortunately, it just happens to be here in the United States because of you, and we appreciate that very much. I'll talk a little bit about the implications of this for Ohio, and then conclude with, how can we capitalize or squander this opportunity? So let me start first by telling you about why Dow cares about shale gas. Not a big surprise. We use the oil equivalent of 850,000 barrels a day of hydrocarbon energy. And that's about as much energy as Australia consumes in a day. And as both, I think, Tom and Kevin said, we use it in several ways. We use it as a fuel, and we use it as a raw material. So in the United States, it's principally natural gas, and very importantly, natural gas liquids like ethane, propane, and butane, and various other anes that I won't mention. So if we were having this conversation 5 years ago, we'd be all collectively lamenting the decline of American manufacturing. It's moving offshore. How are we going to attract new industries? What's going to happen? Why did we allow our energy costs to go to a point where we drove American jobs and manufacturing offshore? As recently in 2009, Dow had made a decision to shut down one of its ethane crackers in St. Charles, Louisiana. And the conversation, and I was part of those conversations, was which one's going to be the next one we shut down? We had already shut down 2 in the previous decade. And in 2005, our CEO testified to Congress that, because of high and volatile natural gas prices, Dow would likely have to invest anywhere else but in the United States for growth. And that's why we got involved in things like ethanol, sugarcane ethanol in Brazil to make ethylene and plastics, why we were doing coal to chemicals projects in China, and of course big investments in the Middle East where we could get long-term cost advantage hydrocarbons to grow our Asia-Pacific business. And Tom showed a great slide of the ethylene cost curve. Well, I have failed to advance my slide. Okay. It is true, it's really sort of gone upside down, where now we are second only to Saudi Arabia in ethane production, but I don't think any of us in this room would have envisioned that Wall Street Journal article of a week or so ago that said that the U.S. probably has already surpassed or will surpass Russia as the largest oil and gas producer. Absolutely amazing. So for us, 5 years ago, we're sitting here watching this story develop and saying to ourselves, geez, is this real? Is this, how much is there? Could you get it out of the ground? At what price? And the $64,000 question, was it wet? And when we talk about wet gas, we talk about all the AINs I mentioned earlier, ethane, propane, the natural gas liquids that I call the pepperoni pizza of petrochemistry. The basic building block that we use to make virtually every part of the organic chemistry we practice is based on those natural gas liquids. And then combined with inorganic chemistry, with chlorine, you get things like polyvinyl chloride pipe and all kinds of things like that. So there's an amazing combination of organic and inorganic chemistry. So we were skeptics. We called ourselves hopeful skeptics. Then we did our research. I mean, since we buy more gas than some countries, we know something about the market, but we wanted to make sure when people tell us that there was a 100-year supply, that was interesting, but the big question is, could you get it out of the ground and at what price, and was it wet? And we concluded that the answer to all of those questions was yes for the foreseeable future, and so we've put our money where our mouth is by announcing investments of in excess of $4 billion in new investments and new capacity in the Gulf Coast, including a restart of that cracker we shut down in St. Charles, Louisiana. Big kudos to the people in St. Charles, because there was a crew that was actually designated to demolish that cracker. And just because we were pinching pennies at the time, I think we postponed the demolition of that cracker. Greatest decision ever made, right? So that plant restarted on Christmas Day, when people there never imagined that it was going to restart. That's just how incredible this turnaround has been. So over the next 7 years, we estimate that these investments that we've announced in the Gulf Coast will employ up to 4,800 workers during peak construction and support more than 35,000 jobs in the broader U.S. economy, including here. So we've started to track these investments and that are being announced across the country, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So Tom had already talked about this. We used to call this the jaws of death back when it was upside down, when the price of ethane was higher than the price of naphtha, crude-based raw materials. But now, what truly is the competitive advantage for the chemical industry is this differential between crude oil and natural gas. And if anybody wonders, now I'm not here to tell you that 6 million jobs were lost because of the price of energy, but there's more than a coincidental relationship between the decline in manufacturing jobs and the spiraling energy prices in the last decade. So what's the nature of this phenomenon that we see? And we see the manufacturing renaissance occurring in three waves. The first wave, it's already upon us, and we're sort of living through it now and talking about it now, and that's largely energy-intensive basic materials. And this goes beyond chemicals, right? We have industries like aluminum, and here a number of the announced, in Ohio, the announced expansions are in steel, right, for obvious reasons. Nucor and U.S. Steel have made announcements. I know Timken has made some expansion announcements, really directly connected to, the energy industry as a result of all the new exploration and production going on. So in the chemical industry, it's the basic blocking and tackling of building, making the building block chemicals that go into everything from paint to carpeting to wall covering and whatever else have you. Like 96% of all manufactured goods have some chemistry in their ancestry. So it's very important to have these building blocks. There's a second wave, and that's really talking about people who would co-locate next to the first wave manufacturers. We have announced along with Mitsui and Idemitsu, a project to off-take ethylene from our cracker one of our crackers that we're going to build in the Gulf Coast, and make something called alpha olefins that they'll sell back to us, 50% of their production. That helps to fund the cost of our project, but they will then sell it to other customers and for export. So you'll see those, and I think you're going to see more of that. We just saw the other day an announcement by BASF and Yara to put in a ammonia plant somewhere in the Gulf Coast. Again, these are all sort of first and second wave types of investments. And, when you listen to some of the stories about BASF and their contemplation of moving to investing their next dollar in the United States, it was because of the unpredictability of the energy situation in Germany. Germany shut down their nuclear capacity. They're importing natural gas from a, politically unreliable neighbor. And they said to the German government that, be careful. And I think they just fulfilled that promise just recently. We started to keep track of all these announcements, and I think Kevin mentioned something like 85 billion or 85 projects. We're up to about 130 projects and over 110 billion. And like Kevin, we say, let's be real, they're not all going to be built, but the fact is this is a tremendous showing of interest and a reaction to this phenomenon. So for Dow, when I talk about these investments occurring in the U.S. Gulf Coast, I guess I tend to agree that the reason why it's there is because there's so much infrastructure already in place. To build on a brownfield site that's already got utilities, it's already got port and transportation infrastructure, it's got utilities, it's got everything self-contained, and the big advantage to these facilities is that they're integrated. And so I think most of that cracking capacity that's going to be built in this country, at least for the foreseeable future, is going to be, in the Gulf Coast. But all of those products go somewhere. And we ran some numbers and found that $418 million worth of product comes up from our Gulf Coast operation into Ohio to be used either by our 7 facilities or by our customers. It's remanufactured further and further on down the chain, like a polyethylene pellet made in St. Charles, Louisiana, winds up as a toy somewhere in Ohio, because this region is, as was previously mentioned, sort of the mecca of plastics, the plastics business. So making use of all that infrastructure, is really what's making this possible. But I would say don't despair if you don't happen to have a cracker or can secure one. I think that for a few months or maybe even a year, there was sort of a cracker fantasy going on. A lot of states are saying, "Ooh, West Virginia wants to build 2, and Pennsylvania wants 1, and Ohio wants 1." If you don't get a cracker, as Tom said, Tom basically provided you all with the roadmap for how to attract the next wave, the third wave of investment. And it can land anywhere. You don't have to be co-located with a cracker to do it. And it's all of those. I would encourage you and elected officials to take Tom's presentation and develop a marketing plan for this region, for the types of industries that he mentioned. And the first place I would go would be to Asia and find anybody who's making plastics based on crude oil economics and tell them about where their customers are and how they can compress their supply chain and how they can be located next to some of the finest universities and technical colleges in the world, and how they can really innovate and take advantage of everything that this market has to offer. So we need strategies that are going to capture that wave. And again, when people talk about LNG exports, would you rather export a fuel and then import a finished good, or take the fuel, take $1 worth of fuel, add $8 worth of value to it, and export the finished product? I'm not trying to make a case against LNG export. I'm simply trying to say that we can capture and create a tremendous amount of value with this raw material. This is a little lift from the list that we've been keeping, and we hired Charles River Associates to apply some job calculations to it. So if you look at Ohio, we see already there's been about $1.8 billion worth of new investment announced, and something like 690 jobs potential, and an indirect employment of 2,200. And the key is going to be to have these kinds of numbers develop beyond the Gulf Coast, because for the reasons Kevin mentioned, you can only build so much at one time in one place and run out of construction workers. There's already a lot of competition for both plant operators and construction workers in the Gulf Coast. So we have estimated about $110 billion worth of new announced investments around the country, and it's going to add between 6 and 8 billion cubic feet a day of natural gas demand across all sectors. I'll talk a little bit about the chemical industry in Ohio. It's either the 6th or the 7th largest chemical industry state in the country. One slide it says 6th, and the other says it could be 7th, but those aren't my numbers, so I'm not going to lay claim to them. But chemistry is the 2nd largest manufacturing industry in Ohio, and with 44,000 direct jobs and about 53,000 indirect jobs, and the average wage is 33% higher than the average manufacturing wage in the state. And the other thing about the chemical and plastics industry, it's hugely innovative. Hugely, it has to be. Constantly inventing ourselves. When I mentioned Herbert Dow founding the company in 1897 to make bromine, we don't make bromine anymore. We haven't made bromine for years. So we're all moving in vastly different directions due to a tremendous amount of innovation. Dow's R&D budget is larger than the R&D budgets of all of the chemistry and chemical engineering programs in all of the universities in the United States. And that's the premium that we place on innovation, and that's another feature that you can use in attracting businesses from outside the United States to Ohio. Whoops, go back. And so the American Chemistry Council, and it has an affiliate organization, the Ohio Chemistry Technology Council, which if you're not familiar with them, you should meet them over in Columbus. But that there's going to be, that if there's a 25% increase in petrochemical supply, it would generate $32 billion in increased U.S. chemical production. And then the natural gas liquid production, they just issued a study that said the natural gas liquid production is projected to double by 2020 to 3.8 billion barrels a day. And in Ohio, that would mean, if you built a cracker, it would be about a $3.2 billion investment. And it would generate about $7.5 billion in additional chemical industry output, bringing the state's industry revenues to more than $32 billion and making it, probably leapfrogging some other state in terms of its productive capacity and its leadership. And potential to create something like 17,000 jobs across the Ohio economy. Boston Consulting Group estimates that 5 million new jobs will be created in U.S. manufacturing by 2020. And as I said earlier, every dollar's worth of natural gas run through our manufacturing economy creates up to $8 in added value. If the mayor's still here, I heard a great story about water and the infrastructure that this region has to produce water. And we all know how important it is to energy production. It's going to be a particular challenge and a constraint to some other regions. And to the extent that this region has plentiful water, plus technology innovation to minimize its use, I think it's a great advantage. Some other areas in the demand that start to influence demand. Now, I'm speaking as a consumer of natural gas. So on the other hand, you have producers saying, don't worry, be happy, there's plenty of gas, 100-year supply, it's all going to be there when you need it. And we sit there and say, but what about, and what about, and what about? And what about the power sector, I think, is the big question. I mean, in this region, there's an awful lot of electricity generated from coal. And depending upon how fast we fuel switch from coal to natural gas, there could be some constraints on the ability, some additional demand, and if we don't supply it readily and meet that demand with increased supply, we could have some dislocations. EPA is regulating greenhouse gases, and there's a tremendous amount of coal plant retirements predicted. Over 1/3 of coal capacity not equipped with the necessary pollution control equipment, and nearly half of coal capacity is 45 years old or older. And there are going to be nuclear plant retirements, and just we've long talked about the need for an all-of-the-above energy policy in this country. We do have a danger that we could kind of by default slip into a one-of-the-above energy policy, and then we get so seduced by natural gas that we decide that we're going to displace nuclear power, we're going to displace coal, we're going to displace the growing number of renewable energy with natural gas. And that's probably, even the energy industry will tell you it's not in our long-term interest as an economy to rely on a single fuel. So I would watch carefully how fast we are able to make this transition to coal, from coal to natural gas. We still think coal belongs in the power portfolio. So there is some new demand we were talking about, whether 130 or 85 or 65 of these projects get built, there's going to be some new industrial natural gas demand, and that's a great thing. There's going to be, you see the trucks outside, there's going to be some increase in the use of natural gas in transportation fuel. As I always like to say, probably not as much as T. Boone Pickens wants, but there's going to be a steady growth in the demand for natural gas in vehicles. We did actually oppose some congressional legislation on tax incentives because, as was shown, I forgot whether it was Tom or Kevin's slides, that the payback period for conversion is like 1.8 years or something like that for converting to natural gas. And so we didn't think that using tax policy was really the best use of taxpayers' money in a fiscally constrained environment. But nonetheless, so there's going to be growth in demand in transportation. Then we have a certain amount that's going to be in the power sector, as I mentioned, just how fast, how aggressive it will be. is not fully known, but that's the sort of the middle slug where the black line is. I apologize for the colors on this slide. They're not too easily distinguishable, but the yeah, I know. I mean, geez, I tried to paste. You know how PowerPoint works. You know, you try to paste something from one presentation. I had a really well-colored slide, and I pasted it on here, and the colors kept changing, and I said, the hell with it. Not my forte. But anyway, so the top line is the top wedge is the high case for LNG exports. Okay, the next one down is the natural gas vehicles, slow but steady growth. The third one from the top is manufacturing renaissance. And the fourth one is electrical retirements. And the rest is sort of the rest of demand, you know, residential, whatever else. The black line is the federal government, the annual energy outlook by the Energy Information Administration. Supply, dry gas supply estimate. Now, whether you think that estimate, you know, it's sort of, is the worst case, or can it go up or down a little bit? What I'm saying is that if we hit the perfect storm of demand, our folks, and remember, the Dow folks that did this analysis, they buy more gas than some countries, okay? That's not a boast, it's just a fact, but we know something about this market, and if all of a sudden there's all of that demand coming on, remember all of the LNG terminals that are going to get approved, however many of them, they'll be constructed between now and 2018, 2020. Most of these manufacturing plants that have been announced will probably start operation. Our new cracker will probably start operation in 2016. A bunch of this demand is going to come on stream between 2016 and 2020. The power plant conversions. Our folks say that and they use this word exactly, it would require heroic amounts of production. Production like we've never seen before. People in this room are probably salivating because, you know, there's plenty of gas, right? But can we get the pipelines? Can we get the workers? Can we get all of the things to make sure that this relationship between supply and demand stays about equal? Because we know what happens. We've seen this movie when demand gets way ahead of supply. And the marginal users, the guy who can turn it off, the guy who can shift production elsewhere, it's not a power plant, it's not a hospital, it's a manufacturer. And so we have to be cautious as we think about making sure that supply and demand remain relatively balanced, because history has shown to us that when they're not, manufacturing goes away. And fortunately, at one time we thought it was going away and never coming back, but it is coming back. So it's a great opportunity. Again, like I said, Dow has put $4 billion on the table to say that this is all going to turn out okay, right? And so, yeah, but I'm just here to say that we have to be mindful of some of these other potential activities. And so that gets me to the how can we screw this up part of my presentation, which is, you know, we can, if we balance supply and demand, we're in good shape. And we have to make sure that, you know, we maintain affordable energy for all, that we have to have the skilled labor, and I think you have a surplus of labor in this region. I think there's another key factor in talking to some elected officials, people who can pass a drug test. That is not an inconsequential consideration in some parts of this region. Competitive rail service. One of the things that's a constraint in the U.S. Gulf Coast is that many of the plants are captive to a single ship, to a single railroad. So to the extent that you have access to competitive hubs where once a product gets to that hub, you can get a quote from a second railroad, that's a beautiful thing. In the Northeast, 76.8% of rail cars have revenue to cost ratios that fit the legal definition of being unreasonably high. I don't know what that number is in this particular region, but the fact is that competitive transportation service and good, road infrastructure is all very important. Capitalize on being close to, on facilities that can be close to their customers. As Tom said, find the guy who makes pens and the guy who makes toys and find out where his customer is. We can supply them from anywhere in the United States, and it doesn't matter where the gas comes from, because in talking to people in the Marcellus region, they said, what's going to happen when the well goes away? When it's played out, or whatever the term is. There are some high decline rates, I understand, in the wells. But the fact is that if you have good, sustainable manufacturing jobs, making toys, making pens, making toothpaste tubes, and if you just have good infrastructure, that gas can come from anywhere. But what you have at the end is a very sustainable manufacturing infrastructure that will serve you. And it just happens to have this added benefit of, rebuilding the American middle class. Now, there's an idea. That would be nice. And then the fact is that you want to support R&D, because most of our companies locate, if we locate an operation, an R&D operation in China, we want to make sure that we're close to a customer and that we're close to some institution of higher learning. But here in the United States is a tremendous advantage. So finding out what your education resources are. So if I want to innovate in the area of plastics, I may want to have great transportation, good workers. I want to have a university that has a program. I want to do all of those things. And I think those are the great opportunities. But again, let's make sure that we have government policy that really embodies all of the above. Let's do energy efficiency to the max. Let's pursue renewables in a practical way. Let's pursue responsible use of our oil and gas resources, and continue to diversify our energy portfolio. Let's make sure that we have the pipeline capacity, and let's export LNG, but let's just be mindful that if we export too much, we could throw this thing out of balance. So all I'm going to conclude with is to say that we have been given a great gift. We have maybe one shot at really, really, really getting it right. And we have to be mindful of all these things, but I would say that you are in a region now that is going to be the sort of the point of the spear in an amazing renaissance. And if, in my lifetime, I never knew anything but scarcity in the energy conversation. And the fact that we're all sitting here talking about this incredible opportunity is we've been given a great gift, but we've also been given a great responsibility to get it right. I'll stop there and answer any questions.
Thank you, Peter. Is this on? Thank you. I hope a lot of guests have questions about Dow and about manufacturing. I have an opening question about government regulation. At the Chamber and among most of the people in the room, I think, we think Ohio is blessed by having virtual supremacy of oil and gas regulation in the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, as opposed to regulation in various cities, counties, communities. And we're also a little nervous about what role the federal government might want to play in starting to regulate shale exploration, production, and everything that goes with it. What should we be worried about?
Be worried about the federal government trying to regulate shale and production and everything that goes with it. I think that the President and the administration are talking a lot about all of the above, but I'm not sure that, well, I'll just say healthcare. Can the federal government manage this phenomenon from Washington better than a state can? Now, there was some lag time, right? I mean, nobody liked it when all these trucks showed up with Oklahoma license plates. And nobody liked it when they could smell the diesel fumes. And, so there's a time when there's sort of some catch-up being played. And I think the states have caught up quite well in terms of their ability to sensibly, impose the right amount of regulation to assure that public companies get more and more involved. They bring bigger, better product stewardship philosophies to the table, and so maybe you don't need as much heavy-handed regulation if you've got the kind of best practices that are being employed as the companies continue to improve their work practices.
You also had regulation as one of the weights on the scale in the supply-demand balance. And to what extent is government regulation required, and how heavy a presence is required to get supply and demand balance right so that the economy keeps growing?
Yeah, I mean, most people say, we've got to let the market do what the market does. I think the government has had more role to play in maybe screwing it up. My story of that is on the T. Boone Pickens plan. T. Boone had a bill introduced in Congress called the Nat Gas Act, and I was walking around the Hill one day, and all of a sudden I see this bill gets introduced in the House with 182 co-sponsors. And when you're a lobbyist and somebody introduces a bill with 182 co-sponsors, that gets your attention. It was bipartisan. So we went back and we looked at these co-sponsors, and like 90 of them were from oil and gas producing states and generally supportive of the industry. The other half of them had never in their lives voted for increased supply. They were all co-sponsors of bills to ban fracking. They support repowering power plants, getting rid of coal. So they were all supporters of demand and all opponents of supply. So that's where I go when I get asked that question about how can we screw this up. And we spent a fair amount of time making it readily apparent to people that you can't repeal Economics 101.
Questions from the audience? Who has one? Joe. Here.
Peter, since you're pretty familiar with what's going on in Washington, when you look at Kevin's presentation, Tom's presentation, your presentation, among general legislators in Washington, do you think there's high degree of awareness of this, some degree of awareness, or not really any awareness?
It's growing, I would say. It wasn't too many years ago that you couldn't have a conversation in Washington about manufacturing. It was, we're transitioning to a service economy. We're gonna, somebody said we're gonna press each other's pants. We're gonna loan money to each other. We're gonna sell each other insurance, and we're gonna do all those things. And we're going to be post-industrial. And I think that 2008, 2009, and the years ensuing sort of refocused people on what happens when your manufacturing economy, slides the way it did, and we almost lost the auto industry. So I think that is more readily apparent, and there's a lot more connectivity between, the different. We need all of these things. It's not like we can do without, a financial services industry, but we really do need to have also a manufacturing industry. And everybody in this room has a responsibility to tell their members of Congress this story, because it's not automatically on their frontal lobes. When they hear about natural gas, they think about it as a fuel. It is not intuitive that it is also, if it was a bakery, if we were a bakery, this would be the flour. And that's the story that I think needs to be reinforced, and how important, how integral it is to growing our manufacturing. And I would also use the middle class. I mean, everybody's focused on getting middle class jobs back up.
Another question. Raise a hand, please. Yes, sir.
Kevin?
Right here.
Yeah, Peter, just to follow up on Joe's question, what's kind of the mood in Washington as it relates to taxation on the oil and gas resources? Because we know they're pretty good at spending.
Yeah. What's going on in Washington? How much time you got? What's not going on in Washington? I think, there's going to be an effort in this then this next go round of brinkmanship over the budget to see if they can get some tax reform. The oil and gas industry is very worried about their some of the taxes, and it's a great, political speech talking point to talk about how the oil and gas industry is not paying its freight. I think the business community is pretty unified around the notion of let's lower the rates, the corporate rate. If we can get to 25%, that would make us the leader in the world in terms of, corporate tax treatment. But that means you do have to do away with some, if not many, of the corporate tax benefits. I think we would oppose the increased taxes on the oil and gas industry absent a broader tax policy deal. And that whatever happens, there have to be adequate transition rules so you don't turn it off, overnight. So I think there's, will we ever get down to a 25% rate? Hard to know. But I think ultimately somebody's got to make a decision to put, reform of entitlements on the table in exchange for something in the area of tax policy, and how do you work out the revenues. I don't see it happening anytime soon. I think there's going to be a lot of talk. I think I'd rather see the certainty that goes along with having an annual budget rather than having this thing expire every 2 to 3 months. I think everybody in this room who's trying to make investments, people are sitting on billions, trillions of dollars of investment that could be unleashed if we could only just get some certainty into the situation.
Let me thank Peter for coming and Dow Chemical for honoring us with its presence at our summit.
Thank you.